Hello everyone, we're back at DLD. We've been here all week talking to some of the conference's leading speakers. It's the 20th anniversary of the first DLD, which was held in January of 2005. And we're using it as an opportunity to think back over the last 20 years. Our guest is Martin Puchner, who's been on the show several times before. He's a professor of literature at Harvard University with a particularly eclectic mind. Martin, what were you doing in January of 2005?
You know, it's funny, prompted by your question, I realized that I was on my most adventurous travel in southern Mexico, in Chiapas. I'd gotten interested how the Maya epic Popol Vuh was used in present-day Maya countries, so Guatemala and Chiapas. And this was in the aftermath of the Zapatista revolution in Chiapas, where a sort of eclectic army had declared part of southern Mexico autonomous. And their leader, El Subcomandante Marcos, had used this ancient epic for some of their communiques. So I traveled through that area. It was my most adventurous travel so far, and it really set the tone. I didn't realize it at the time, for doing more travel writing, for traveling all over the world and trying to figure out what's going on culturally, how ancient texts are used in the present. And looking back, actually, that trip was really central.
Martin, you're a professor of literature at Harvard. You've written and read a lot of books. It seems as if in our analysis of this 20 years that some of the people we've spoken to consider it a unique moment in world history. Nothing like this has ever happened before. Do you think we as a species tend to think that our times are always the most interesting, and when anyone is ever asked about the last 20 years of their life or of their society, they will come up with that response?
They probably do. So maybe what we should focus on is not the kind of general statement, is this a transitional period, is this a revolutionary period, as opposed to some other period, but what it is that we perceive to be the novelty here, what has really changed, and how we integrate that into our sense of history, where we came from, how previous generation had lived, and how things have changed during our lifetime. But I think you're right, our own lifetimes are always the most deeply felt, and there's always something that changes. So maybe not whether this is the most revolutionary time, but in what way is the question to ask.
And for you as a professor of literature and of writing and reading, has this last 20 years been particularly significant, perhaps because of the invention of AI and generative AI in particular, which is built around language?
Well, that's certainly true of the last few years. Essentially, since OpenAI came out, it's changed how I think about language, how I think about access to the past. I'm thinking through it, as we speak every day. I've fooled around with these chatbots where you can talk to Socrates and Napoleon and all these other figures. So that's certainly true of the last 2 years, let's say. If I think about the way in which innovations, new technologies have changed the way I work in the last 20 years, I would say it was a more gradual change where, from 2005 onward, I definitely noticed that there were more and more texts, obscure texts, that were available on the internet. I spent less time in libraries and more time online. I was beginning a project on the history of the philosophical dialogues, and started to type in all kinds of search terms into Google and came up with these obscure plays centered on Socrates that I had never heard of and that I don't think I would have been able to find. So that idea of a kind of synthetic search, of drawing on many sources and coming up with these obscure nuggets and forming them into a pattern, that's something that I would say gradually emerged. Every year there is a little bit more since 2005, but that's suddenly accelerated with AI.
It's interesting you mentioned Socrates. Socrates, of course, was famously a champion of the spoken rather than the written word. Are we going through something quite as apocalyptic now as Socrates went through in antiquity?
I think about Socrates a lot in precisely this way, Andrew, and I think you're right that Socrates had two worries about writing, and which is why he insisted on the spoken word. One worry was that if we write things down and if we rely more and more on that storage capacity, we would no longer train our minds, and our minds would somehow atrophy because we would no longer have to remember things ourselves. And we certainly see that with worries about the iPhone and so on and so forth now. And the other was that something you write it down, it can be taken out of context. You can't ask the author follow-up questions. And so you could say this is a worry about what we might call fake news and lack of control. And that certainly resonates with our time as well. So yeah, I think in some ways Socrates' critique of writing has come roaring back in the present. But at the same time, when I think about how I interacted with Socrates, it was all through the texts written down by his student Plato. So I'd been reading Socrates, perversely, since he didn't like writing. I'd been reading Socrates, and this is what prompted me to build this chatbot where you can talk to Socrates, because I felt like I was kind of reanimating Socrates, and I could now interact with Socrates in a way that he would have preferred, namely through an exchange of ideas.
Martin, many of your colleagues in the academy have become more and more culturally pessimistic over the last 20 years. Lots of talk about students not reading, not being interested in reading, the implications of social media, of TikTok. When you think back to 2005, do you think you're more or less of a cultural pessimist now in 2025 than you were in 2005?
Yeah, interesting. When I look back, I certainly feel that what a lot of my colleagues worry about, namely the decline of the humanities, if we just restrict it to that for a moment, that it started there slowly. Somewhat fewer students were taking our classes. There was some sense that the humanities had sort of lost their seat at the table of important conversations. Slowly, gradually, people sort of noticed it, but didn't worry about it too much. And then it's totally accelerated since then in the last 20 years. So if I look back, you would think that I should have been more optimistic then than I'm now. But in some sense, maybe because I have a contrarian streak, I think much more about the role of the humanities now, because they have lost so much ground. And we can talk about the reasons. I think a lot of it are homemade problems, and then other things have to do with changes in technology and economics and culture. But because there's so much pessimism around me, I think I'm sort of willing myself into a more optimistic mode, just maybe to keep myself from going out of my mind. But again, just talking not so much about the world in general, but just my little corner of the world, the humanities, because I see so much humanities leaning activity outside the academy, the growth of, reading clubs and podcasts and YouTube videos and adult education and all of, retreats. And so that makes me optimistic, and it makes me feel like we in the academy have to get our act together.
Have you noticed much change in your students, the kind of kids who took your classes in 2005 versus the ones that take them today in 2025?
Yeah, I have. And it makes, one thing about it makes me a little bit sad, where I feel like the smartest students, there are always exceptions. The smartest students are not going to study literature or classics or history. And I think I understand why. I'm not sure if I were a student now that I would be, going to study or specialize in literature. So I definitely noticed that. And again, that change didn't come out of nowhere. It was already underway a little bit 20 years ago, but it certainly accelerated. I have reacted to it for myself by teaching many more general education classes, teaching classes that reach engineering students and so on and so forth, because I feel like that's where the energy is. But yes, I do. I've noticed that the kinds of students who are attracted to the humanities are different.
There are many social psychologists, Jonathan Haidt comes to mind in particular, who see the early 2000 teens, particularly 2012, as a moment where everything changed, where we had the origins of the age of anxiety, and it's very much bound up with the invention of the iPhone and of social media. Do you share Haidt's thesis on anxiety and the relationship between it and technology?
Yeah, I think there is. I'm sure technology of a particular kind has intensified, especially teen anxiety. But I saw, again, looking back 20 years or even more, let's say 30 years, I feel like in some ways this started earlier. You could tell one story about the rise of psychopharmaceuticals, where students who without them, I think, wouldn't have made it into college, suddenly were medicated enough to make it to college in increasing numbers, but nevertheless then struggle in college. They were kept just enough to make it. So I feel like there are so many more students with anxieties who use mental health services, who talk about their mental health history in applications, both to undergrads and to graduate school. And so I think that there's a cultural component to it, that people want to talk, that somehow there's a kind of almost cultural cachet to talking about your mental health problems. So there are cultural and the technological angle. But I actually the underlying root I would see actually in the rise of these psychopharmaceuticals that brought a whole generation of students into college classrooms that wouldn't have shown up there without it.
You touch on the role of therapy. Can we have a therapeutic culture which is culturally legitimate? I mean, of course, Freud opened that Pandora's box, and some of the greatest thinkers of the 19th and 20th century are people who experience mental illness of one kind or another. Nietzsche, from your country of Germany, Nietzsche and Max Weber come to mind. Is this, in a sense, healthy? To finally be telling the truth about mental health and its centrality in the human experience? Or is this uniquely a feature of the early digital 21st century?
I think it is healthy. I mean, I think it's good that mental health is not stigmatized in the same way, that it's recognized as an illness, that there are many forms of treatment available, from drugs to different forms of therapy. There's now a resurgence of psychedelics and their potential.
And lots of talk of psychedelics at DLD 2025.
Exactly. So, in some sense, or in every sense, I'm for that. I think what I was thinking about a moment ago was more about how that changed composition of students and just brought students into the classroom, into universities that have serious mental illnesses, that are kept manageable in these various ways, but that that are now part of life of college. But I wouldn't, if I raise this as a change, it was primarily to say it's not all due to technology. I think that's the main point. But I do think it's good. I do worry that there is a kind of, as I said, kind of cultural cachet connected to certain ways of talking about mental health or trauma, and where it's become almost like a calling card or something that you are sort of encouraged to do even if there isn't a trauma. And so that I think we cultures always generate certain plots that students then apply, or anyone applies and that sort of runs with. So I think there's a use of the trauma plot, as some people, Perul Segal, New Yorker writer, wrote a great essay about that, where or a certain sense that if you want to apply to college, you have to tell a kind of trauma story or a victimization story or something like that. So I think there are forms where it becomes sort of a counterproductive. But this is not, no, I think mental illness is a fact of life and has always been, and its stigmatization was a bad thing, and I'm glad it's no longer that way.
One of the most reported narratives of the last 20 years, Martin, has been the crisis of trust. We don't trust external institutions, we don't trust news, we don't trust other people. And there's a lot of concern about that. But is trust in itself a kind of zero sum? And the less we trust external institutions and media and news organizations and government, the more we trust ourselves.
Interesting. I mean, when we talk about trust, we also have to think about its opposite, which is kind of skepticism. And I would say, in general, skepticism is a good thing. That's what brought about the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, asking questions, not taking things on blind trust. So I think the lack of trust, or to say positively, skepticism, is an immensely healthy and good and important thing. So I wouldn't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater here, and just say trust is this great value that we should worship. Absolutely. But of course you're right. Skepticism or distrust can also become a kind of corrosive force where everything is just, where you don't trust anything, and that can very quickly become a kind of paranoia, and we see that, of course, a lot of evidence of that. So how do you balance it, or is it a question of balance between trust and skepticism? Or I don't know that I have a good answer, but all I want to say is that I don't think we should go back to an old model of trust if it ever existed. That doesn't strike me as productive.
Conservatives have blamed a lot of all this cultural upheaval anxiety on what they call postmodernism. Postmodernism, you don't need me to tell you as a professor of literature, it seemed to me at least to be built on a kind of distrust of the text, and a complicated relationship between us as the reader and the book. Do you think in the last 20 years, in terms of your experience as a teacher of great texts, that people trust books, the text, more or less?
It's interesting. I mean, if you ask people, should people read more? I think it would be very hard to find people who say, no, definitely don't read more. So on that level, there is a sort of free-floating idea that it's important to read. And if you will, trust in reading, or an aspiration or an idea that there's a sort of self-improvement, or that kids should read. And if they play video games, it's bad. If they read, it's good. And in some sense, it's an almost naive belief, because there are also periods when people were very skeptical of reading certain things. In the 19th century, they were all worried about reading romances and that it would sort of get people too excited.
Especially women.
Especially women.
Novels,
and
course.
Especially French novels. So it's interesting that as the rate of reading has declined, somehow the idea that reading is valuable has gone up. So there's a paradox here that I'm puzzling out a lot, because I feel like I'm always an advocate for reading. I see that it's declining. I'm trying to figure out how to bring it back. So I embrace the idea that people in general think it's so important to read, but I'm puzzled by the fact that they seem to believe that the less they read,
the more they know. And the paradox, of course, is that people have trust in the act of reading, but they don't have trust in books.
Maybe that's right.
Is that compatible?
I don't know whether they don't have trust in books. You know, I'm always struck by the fact that in the kind of public sphere, let's say, that one of the biggest vehicles about starting a conversation is still books. You know, book reviews. You launch a book, you go to a DLD and talk about it. So, and it, you know, books take so long to write, they take long to read, but nevertheless, they still seem to sort of almost guarantee, in some sense, and whether that's justified or not is another matter, that, you know, someone has spent a period of time on something, that there's a sort of extended argument that takes into account counter arguments, that tells a story. And so it's interesting. You would think that in this short attention span economy that books would have completely disappeared, and they haven't. Maybe people don't read them, but they still seem to play an important function in the public discourse.
Yeah, and of course one wonders whether they ever read them. Last year at DLD, Martin, you gave a talk about whether AI can create culture. It's a very intriguing question. AI can, of course, read and summarize books. Could that be the death knell of reading and books? When you have an algorithm that in 10 seconds or 5 seconds or probably less than a second can summarize a book and answer all our questions without us reading it?
Yeah.
What's going to be the point of reading in the age of AI, especially when we get to AGI, which seems inevitable, at least in the long run?
Right. No, it's interesting, and there are already companies that present themselves mostly as a sort of Blinkist as one, and others of sort of summarizing, especially nonfiction books, and it does seem to, there seem to be much more demand or an intuitive sense that it's good to have a summary, sort of the executive summary of a nonfiction book. I see much less of it in fiction, because there I feel like the idea is the experience of reading and spending time with these characters in this fictional world essential and can't really replaced by a summary. I mean, there have been summaries of fictional books, you know, forever, even before AI. So I think there's a real difference here between fiction and nonfiction. But even on the nonfiction summaries, I'm not against summaries, because I think there is an unbelievable amount of information out there. There are unbelievable numbers of books that have been written. So why not summarize them? I feel like that's one of the great strengths of AI. It's very good at summary. And I don't think a summary doesn't necessarily replace reading. It could also spark an interest in something. It could be a form of search and filtering. Oh, this sounds interesting. I want to explore that more. And I think that's the premise of some of these kind of nonfiction book summary kind of businesses. And I'm actually thinking about how to work on something somewhat related that would give you parts of a novel, frame them, allow you to chat with the author, interact with the text in a way that's not been possible before, and maybe then lead you to spend more time reading. So I don't believe in the story that AI will now do all the reading for us, though I think reading and engaging with texts will change, or is changing, with AI. And I think that can be maybe a good thing if used right.
AI, of course, is the most mature development we have yet of a kind of collective intelligence.
Yeah.
How will that collective intelligence, or how is that collective intelligence shaping or reshaping both the writer and the reader?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, writing was collective for the longest time, predominantly collective, probably until the invention of print just a few hundred years ago. You know, scribes would transcribe text, add commentary, editors would add something to it. I mean, texts like the Bible, for example, of course, have no author, or the 1001 Nights. So there's a lot of collective writing going on in the pre-modern era. So in some sense, I think you're right. It is making it more collective in a sense, but that's not the end of writing as we know it. It's actually a return to how writing used to be. I mean, reading is more individualized, it seems to me. Before the advent of print, people would read around to groups of people. The idea of the university lecture is a good example, because it was expensive to replicate these texts. So someone would read, and 100 people or 200 people would be in one room. So that's a collective reading or listening, if you will. Whereas we, of course, have these hyper-individualized devices. So reading doesn't seem to me collective, although now that I think about it, of course we share a lot about our reading experience, and so there's that collective component to it. Discussion posts, Goodreads does that.
And you were touching on it earlier, the living collective text that can be changed through AI. So in a sense, perhaps the post-structuralists were right when they predicted the death of the author.
I think they were.
They didn't quite understand why, but they had an instinct.
Definitely, and I think if you look at some of these, especially French theorists of the sort of mid-century, who developed this idea that the death of the author and the text and the logic of the text, they were actually reading some of Shannon and some of the computer scientists and computer code. I think is a very interesting overlap that's not been studied enough. There's something that's now being excavated. So this idea that language is sort of a system, that it's not that we're sort of nodes in that system of significance, and we make moves in it, but we don't own it. We are not its author. We are sort of born into it and operate in it. I think that sense of textuality, to use one of these terms these mostly French theorists developed, I think, yes, they turned out to be right.
So, Martin, finally, where do we go in the next 20 years? You're a Harvard professor, so I'm not going to ask you anything too vulgar about predicting 2045, but what broad trends do you expect in your areas of expertise, reading and writing and publishing and books? Are you generally, you're a well-balanced fellow, you're not hysterical like so many others, either for or against this new technology. Are you cautiously optimistic? Would that be a fair way of describing your position?
I think I am, and the area I think in which I'm most optimistic actually has to do with education. I was an early adopter of MOOCs when they started 15 years ago, and they came up with emerged with a lot of promise that it would lower the cost of education, because education is so expensive, especially in the United States, but also in many other places. And so the idea that you could access free lectures from anywhere, I think, was great. MOOCs didn't quite keep the promise that people associated with them, because it turned out that they were very sort of a broadcast model. You had to have a lot of discipline to sort of sit through them, and so it turned out that the ones with most education already had the most education were able to avail themselves of that. But I think that is now changing as online education is becoming more interactive, for example, through chatbots, but also through much more interactive platforms. Harvard is just starting a new, much more interactive platform. I think this sort of individualized learning at high quality at a much lower cost is, I think, coming more closely within reach. And I think that would be huge, because the inequities in higher education around the globe are just enormous. And if you can provide high quality, engaging education to lots of people, potentially anyone, I do believe that that would be a huge change. And so that's where I feel like the previous sort of promise fallen somewhat flat, though not entirely, but I do believe that we may be at an inflection point, and certainly 20 years is a safe horizon. I do predict that education, the whole field of education, will be transformed by it, and I think mostly actually in a good way.
Yeah, of course, it's like predicting the next 5 centuries. But finally, Martin, you noted that you've been playing around with Socrates chatbots. In 2045, you may or may not still be teaching at Harvard, but will there be a place for the Martin Puchners of the future? Will academics have any value in an age of AGI, where we can create Socrates or Tennyson or Shakespeare? What will living humans bring, so to speak, to the party, especially experts, scholars, teachers?
Yeah. Well, teaching, I think it's easiest to answer the question, or to answer a question positively, that is, human teachers will still bring something to the party in teaching, because it's such an affective kind of work. It's not just intellectual, it's not just summarizing things. It's an interactive thing between teachers and students. This is also why, it can be abused in all kinds of ways, but it's an important interpersonal. And we saw that during COVID. So when I speak about the promises of online education, I'm of course super aware that nothing does replace this affective group experience of people in the room. It's just a very expensive proposition. It's by definition non-scalable. So this is why I'm sort of gung-ho with about online education. But I do believe, just as film didn't replace theater, or as print didn't replace the lecture, actually, even though you think it should have, because now it was easier to replicate text, or now, of course, for free almost, and yet people do come to lecture. That I think that interpersonal relationship coming together in a place remains something that we biological beings value immensely, and that's important in education and other spheres. So I don't think that will go away entirely at all.
Well, that's good to hear from Martin Puchner. It certainly won't be 2045, Martin, until we speak again. You bring a uniquely eclectic mind and voice to these subjects of technology, culture, and reading and scholarship. Thank you so much. We will talk again in the not too distant future.
Thank you, Andrew.